Part 1. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger I at any combat range. Not at 500 meters, not at 200 meters, not at 50 meters, pressed it against the steel point blank. That was not rumor. That was geometry and metallurgy, measured in laboratories and proven in blood across North Africa and Italy and every hedgerow in Normandy. The Tiger I's hull carried 100 millimeters of armor. Sherman's gun, at maximum, could pierce 60 millimeters at 1,000 meters. The math did not bend because American boys were dying inside it. The math was simply the math. The Germans knew it. Tiger and crews painted kill rings on their gun barrels the way fighter aces painted kill marks on their cockpits. They had good reason. A single Tiger I, properly positioned, could engage an American armored company and destroy vehicles at ranges where American return fire was physically impossible. This was not German propaganda. It was documented battlefield reality, verified in thousands of engagements, reported in American after-action reports that commanders read with expressions they tried to keep from their faces. American tank crews called it Tiger fever. The condition was simple to describe and impossible to cure. Under stress, any German tank became a tiger in the mind of the man watching it through a periscope. The fear preceded the contact. It altered the decision before the decision was made. Men who knew they were facing Panzer IVs hesitated as if facing tigers. The hesitation cost time. Time cost lives. The Panther made it worse. Introduced in 1943 and deployed in mass. At Kursk, the Panther weighed 45 tons. Its frontal armor ran 80 millimeters thick at 55 degrees of slope, which translated to the effective protection of approximately 140 millimeters of vertical steel. Its gun, the 75mm K-42, fired shells at higher velocities than the Tiger's 88 and could penetrate 138 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. Against the standard Sherman with its 75mm gun, the disparity was not a disadvantage. It was a sentence. German tankers understood this with the clarity that comes from consistent experience. They developed standard tactics built around it. Position at maximum range. Acquire targets first through superior optics. Destroy before the enemy can close to dangerous distances. A single Panther holding a ridge could stop entire armored companies. Veteran crews in heavy tank battalions described something that bordered on invulnerability, a sensation grounded not in arrogance but in repeated, verified experience that their armor deflected what the enemy sent while their guns ended whatever the enemy was. By late 1944, with Germany losing the war in every strategic dimension, this confidence had become one of the last coherent reasons German armored crews continued fighting. Fuel was short, ammunition was rationed, air cover was a memory, infantry support was thinning to nothing. But the machine underneath them, the Panther, the Tiger, the tank itself, that still worked, that still killed. They were holding on to the mathematics. And the mathematics were about to be proven wrong in ways that would cost not just men and metal, but the entire psychological architecture that was keeping the remnants of the Wehrmacht upright. The man most responsible for the delay in answering those mathematics was not a coward. He was not incompetent. He was a career soldier who had spent decades thinking carefully about how wars are fought, and who had built a doctrine that was entirely sensible for the world he understood. His name was Leslie McNair. He was 61 years old in the summer of 1944. He commanded Army Ground Forces, the institutional brain of the American Army that determined how units were organized, equipped, and trained for combat. He was sharp, experienced, and genuinely convinced of what he believed. What he believed was this: tanks should support infantry. They should not fight other tanks. Enemy armor appeared. The answer was tank destroyers, specialized vehicles with powerful guns, but lighter armor, faster and cheaper and easier to produce than true heavy tanks. Tank destroyers would handle tank threats. Tanks would do the work tanks were meant to do. Doctrine had merit in theory. In theory, German heavy tanks and American armor would occupy separate roles on the battlefield, and specialists would manage the difficult engagements. In theory, the system would work the way a system drawn on a map in a quiet room is supposed to work. But German tanks did not cooperate with the theory. They integrated into defensive networks where American armored units had to engage them directly, without tank destroyers perfectly positioned, without the geometry that doctrine assumed. American tankers were dying in Shermans against an enemy whose equipment the doctrine was supposed to handle through other means. General Glazon Marcus Barnes had seen this coming. Barnes ran research and development for Army Ordnance. He was 55 years old, methodical, and had begun pushing for something called the T-26 project in September of 1942. Weeks after reports from Tunisia made the Sherman's inadequacy undeniable. T-26 would carry 90 millimeters of gun, 102 millimeters of frontal armor, and be built around the lessons every after-action report from the desert was screaming to anyone willing to read them. Nair resisted at every stage, not from cruelty, not from indifference to the men dying, from genuine institutional conviction that his doctrine was correct and that the solution to German armor was better deployment of existing systems, not a fundamental redesign of the American armored fleet. The debate consumed months, consumed years. While it continued, American factories produced Shermans at $2,000 a month, and American crews burned in them. The conflict between Barnes and McNair was never resolved by argument. It was resolved by the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when 400 Panthers and a significant number of Tiger IIs tore through American armored lines in the Ardennes and made the inadequacy of the Sherman undeniable from every possible angle. Individual Shermans required numerical superiority of 4 or 5 to 1 to engage a single Panther with acceptable losses. Even then, the casualties were severe. After-action reports from the Ardennes did not suggest. They stated plainly what was true and had always been true and had been denied at cost for 2 years. But before the Bulge, before the forced decision, before Barnes finally received authorization to ship M26 Pershing tanks to Europe in January of 1945, an event occurred that closed the argument in a different and more permanent way. July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy. More than 1,500 heavy bombers trailed across the sky south of St. Lo, carpet bombing a narrow strip of German positions to open the way for American armor. Operation was the largest tactical air support effort of the war to that point. McNair had come to the front to watch. He positioned himself with forward units to observe the results of the doctrine he had built, the air-ground coordination that was supposed to leverage American industrial power into battlefield advantage. Something went wrong. Some of the bombs fell short, American bombs, falling on American positions. More than 100 American soldiers died in the friendly fire incident, killed not by the enemy, but by the weight of their own side's effort. McNair was among them. He died in the dirt of Normandy on July 25th, 1944, killed by American bombs. One of the few four-star generals the United States lost in combat in World War II, one of the senior American officers to die anywhere in the fighting. He did not live to see December's Ardennes. He did not live to read the after-action reports that would finally prove what Barnes had been arguing since 1942. He did not live to be confronted with the consequences of what he had decided, or to have the opportunity to reconsider it in the face of evidence he could not deny. It was simply gone. And the men who had been dying in Shermans continued dying for 4 more months before the mathematics finally changed. Part 2. The tanks were listed on the shipping manifests as heavy maintenance equipment. The workers at Fisher Tank Arsenal who built them had been told they were making an improved variant of the Sherman. Components were manufactured at separate facilities so that no single person outside the classified program could understand what the complete machine actually was. When the first 20 Pershing tanks departed New York Harbor in January of 1945, they were covered with tarps and surrounded by personnel instructed not to discuss what they were transporting or where. The secrecy served purposes that extended beyond tactical surprise against the Germans. American commanders understood something they did not commit to official documents in explicit language. If frontline tank crews learned that a superior machine had existed in development while they were burning inside Shermans, the psychological consequences could not be predicted and could not be managed. The men who had lost friends in what they called Sherman brew-ups, the immunity fires that made the tank a death trap, were still fighting. They were still being asked to climb into Shermans every morning. The decision to classify the Pershing program from America's own frontline forces was not incidental. It was calculated. Barnes led a specialized team called the Zebra Mission to support the tank's deployment, providing engineering expertise to manage the mechanical problems that still emerged from a design that had moved from prototype to production under urgent wartime pressure. He oversaw crew selection personally. Tank commanders with multiple confirmed kills, gunners with exceptional marksmanship scores, loaders physically strong enough to manage 90mm ammunition's weight through hours of combat, drivers experienced with heavy vehicles. These crews trained at a facility near Aachen before deployment. They learned a machine that was unlike anything they had operated before, not merely in its armor and its gun, but in what it implied. They were experiencing, for the first time, something that should have existed years earlier. Relief was real. The bitterness underneath it was real too. February 25, 1945. The town of Elsdorf, Germany. The morning was cold. The 3rd Armored Division was pushing through the Roer River sector, and the Pershing designated as Fireball moved with a Sherman platoon providing security. Sergeant Nicholas Mashlanik commanded from the turret. He had 15 tank kills recorded from Normandy through the winter. He had received his Pershing only days before and was still learning the machine's handling when the day turned against him. Approximately 9:30 in the morning, a Tiger I fired from concealment inside a building approximately 100 yards away. The first round struck the turret at the mantlet, penetrating through the mantlet's thinnest point. The armor-piercing shell passed through the crew compartment. Corporal John DeRigi and Private Alexander Chessa were killed instantly. The second shot hit the main gun barrel, detonating the chambered round. The third shot missed as technician 5th grade Ray Payne threw the tank into reverse, backing away before additional fire could find them. Mashlanik was wounded but alive. He rallied his surviving crew and organized evacuation. Fireball sat in the street for 6 hours. It was in no man's land, too exposed for American recovery vehicles to approach. German forces could see it but could not reach it under American fire. The Tiger that had destroyed it was operating with minimal fuel support. Its crew knew ammunition resupply was uncertain. When American forces counterattacked that afternoon with artillery and air support, the German tank withdrew. By evening, American recovery teams reached Fireball under covering fire. The tank was salvaged, towed to a maintenance area, repaired, and eventually returned to combat with a replaced gun barrel. The opportunity had passed. This was Germany's single closest approach to capturing an intact Pershing. In 1942 or 1943, when the Wehrmacht still possessed the logistics to act on such an opportunity, a heavy recovery vehicle would have been available. Air cover might have been possible. The tank could have been towed to Kummersdorf, the German proving grounds south of Berlin, where captured Allied equipment underwent systematic evaluation. Engineers would have disassembled the 90mm gun measured its characteristics, analyzed the ammunition properties, tested the armor composition. The intelligence might have influenced German tactical doctrine, might have led to modified engagement procedures, might have added weeks or months of additional difficulty to Allied operations in Germany's final collapse. Germany, in February 1945, was not Germany in 1942. The infrastructure that had made systematic technical evaluation one of the Wehrmacht's genuine strengths was collapsing along with everything else. Kummersdorf had been evacuated in January as Soviet forces approached Berlin. Heavy recovery vehicles were increasingly unavailable. The institutional capacity to act on an opportunity like Fireball no longer existed. Tiger withdrew, the repair crews came, and the Germans never got another chance. March 6, 1945. Cologne, Germany, 3:47 in the afternoon. A Panther from Panzer Brigade 106 had positioned itself at an intersection near the Cologne Cathedral, hull down with good fields of fire and withdrawal routes behind it. The placement was textbook defensive doctrine, executed by an experienced crew. The city was a ruin. American forces were pushing in from multiple directions. The Panther's commander, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Bartelborth, had watched an American Sherman advance into his field of fire and destroyed it with a single shot. 3 crew members died. Panther's gun was already traversing toward the next target when Sergeant Robert Early's Pershing appeared on a parallel street. Corporal Clarence Smoyer sat in the gunner's seat. Smoyer had trained extensively on the Pershing's fire control system. He had learned its optics and its characteristics, and the way it behaved under the conditions actual combat produced. Through his periscope, he acquired the Panther as it rotated, the transverse motion exposing the side armor 70 millimeters while the front armor faced away. Smoyer fired. The 90 millimeter armor-piercing round struck the Panther at the turret ring, where the armor was thinnest. The penetration was complete. The shell passed through the crew compartment and detonated stored ammunition. The Panther's interior became fire in less than a second. Bartelborth died. 3 additional crew members died inside the vehicle. 1 man survived the initial penetration. That man was burned severely. He was evacuated to a German field hospital where he died the following day, March 7th, 1945. He died without providing systematic tactical intelligence to German forces. He died without being able to explain to German intelligence officers what he had seen, what he had faced, what had killed his commander and his crewmates in 15 seconds. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 15 seconds from the moment Smoyer acquired the target to the moment the Panther was burning. The sole survivor never had time to understand what he had encountered. He likely never identified the vehicle that killed him as distinct from a standard Sherman. He was a man in a burning tank who escaped and died of his burns, not a source of intelligence. The Americans, meanwhile, had demonstrated on film what the Pershing could accomplish against German armor at close range. Signal Corps cameramen captured the engagement in footage that would become one of the most widely studied tank versus tank encounters of the entire war. But the Germans never learned what had happened at Cologne Cathedral from anyone who was there and survived. What Smoyer's single round had actually done was not complicated in technical terms, but the implications were. The 90mm M3 gun fitted to the Pershing had been derived from anti-aircraft weapon development. The same gun family equipped the M26 tank destroyer the Germans had already encountered. Variant mounted in the Pershing's turret fired its 24-pound armor-piercing round at muzzle velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. Standard AP ammunition could penetrate 119 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. This was sufficient to defeat the Tiger I's frontal armor at normal combat distances. The specialized high-velocity armor-piercing round with its tungsten carbide core could penetrate 221 millimeters at the same distance. This threatened even the King Tiger's frontal plate, the thickest armor fielded by any production German tank. Gun's barrel extended more than 50 feet from the breech face. This gave the Pershing its distinctive silhouette, a long, thick barrel protruding beyond the front of the hull at an angle that no Sherman carried. The silhouette was identifiable to any trained observer who knew what to look for. German tank crews encountering Pershings for the first time had no recognition training. There was no German field manual covering this vehicle type. When German tankers saw it, they saw something they had no framework for categorizing. The gyro-stabilized mounting allowed the Pershing to fire accurately while moving, a capability German tanks did not possess. German doctrine required stationary firing positions for long-range accuracy. German crews were trained and equipped for engagements, conducted from concealment, hull down, stationary. The Pershing stabilization was imperfect by later standards, but functional in the conditions of Germany's collapse, where fluid combat at moderate ranges had replaced the methodical long-range gunnery of earlier years. The fire control system combined magnification options comparable to German optics with this stabilization capability. German engineering often produced superior individual components. American engineering integrated adequate components into systems optimized for actual combat rather than theoretical performance peaks. The armor reflected the same philosophy. 102 millimeters on the frontal glacis at 46 degrees, 114 millimeters on the turret face. Not impenetrable to German heavy guns, but formidable against the 75 millimeter weapons most German armor and anti-tank guns carried by early 1945. The Pershing was not an attempt to out-Tiger the Tiger. It was an attempt to compete with German heavy tanks while remaining mobile, reliable, and producible in the numbers industrial democracy could sustain. The Ford Giaf engine, producing approximately 500 horsepower, was not exceptional by the performance standards German engineers applied, but it used readily available components that American maintenance crews understood. Started in cold weather. It ran when German engines of equivalent sophistication required specialist attention that frontline maintenance increasingly could not provide. Mechanical reliability over ultimate performance. Sufficient quality over theoretical maximum. The American engineering philosophy that German designer had often dismissed was proving more sustainable across sustained operations than German precision. Production numbers were numbers German commanders carefully avoided sharing with frontline troops. Fisher Body Division had been manufacturing automobiles before 1942. It had converted to tank production in months and was now producing Pershings alongside continued Sherman output. Total Pershing production would reach 2,212 tanks by October 1945. Beginning in November 1944, Germany produced 1,347 Tiger I tanks across the entire war from August 1942 to August 1944. Germany produced 492 Tiger II tanks from January 1944 to March 1945. The Americans had built more Pershings in less than a year than Germany built Tigers in 3 years. Sherman production continued simultaneously at rates that dwarfed German tank manufacturing across all types combined. German crews fighting in the Ruhr and along the Rhine in March and April of 1945 did not know these numbers. German intelligence agencies that might have gathered and distributed such analysis were collapsing along with the Reich's administrative structure. Frontline tankers knew what they could see through their periscopes and hear over their radios. What they were hearing, fragmentary and incomplete and distorted by the chaos of retreat, described American tanks they could not identify. Tanks with long guns. Tanks that survived hits that should have killed them. Tanks that penetrated German heavy armor at ranges where German crews thought they were safe. Harp 3 Oberfeldwebel Karl Steiner had been fighting in Panthers since France. He was captured near Kassel in early April of 1945 and interviewed by American intelligence officers through a German-speaking interpreter. His account was preserved in American archives. He described an engagement on April 4th. His Panther had positioned hull down with good fields of fire. They had destroyed 2 Shermans at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Standard engagement. The crew was confident. Everything was proceeding according to the tactical logic that had carried them through 3 years of withdrawal and attrition. Then something appeared at the edge of his periscope's field of view. His gunner saw it first. Feldwebel Bruno, the gunner, said, "That is not a Sherman." The turret was too large. The gun extended too far. The silhouette did not match any vehicle in the German recognition manuals. Steiner ordered the gunner to engage. The shot struck. It struck the frontal armor and did not penetrate. In 3 years of combat, their Panther's frontal armor had never been penetrated. The American vehicle fired once. The round entered the crew compartment. The penetration was complete. Bruno was killed instantly. 2 other crew members were wounded. Steiner ordered immediate evacuation. The crew bailed out of a Panther that had never before been defeated by frontal fire and had now been defeated by a single shot from a vehicle none of them could name. In his interview, Steiner's confusion was specific and recorded. He said he had wondered whether he was facing a Soviet tank somehow transferred to the Western Front. He said the Americans were not supposed to have weapons that could do this. He said the most disturbing part was not that they had been hit. It was that they had been hit by something whose existence they had not known to expect. And then he said what had stayed with the American intelligence officer long enough that it was preserved with careful transcription. He said it made him question what else they did not know. If American industry could produce such tanks in secret, what else had they been wrong about? What other capabilities had been concealed or underestimated or dismissed by intelligence that had told them certain things were impossible? Question hung there. In the transcript, in the record, unanswered. Hauptmann Werner Wolf had commanded Panthers since Kursk in the summer of 1943. He was captured near Magdeburg on April 18th, 1945. With a clarity about what had happened to him and to Germany that came from having watched too much to maintain comfortable illusions. His tank had been destroyed near Halle. He described the engagement with the precision of a professional soldier filing a report on his own defeat. His Panther had fired at the American tank and scored a hit. The hit had not penetrated. The American vehicle had returned fire once. His tank had burned. In his interview, he said this: "We already knew we were losing. We had known that for some time. But I had believed we were losing because of numbers. Because America could produce more Shermans than we could produce Panthers. Because the logistics were against us. Because the air situation was impossible. Not because American engineering had surpassed ours." He paused in the transcription. "We had been fundamentally wrong about our enemy's capabilities. It made me question everything else we had been told." Wolf's clarity was the clarity of a man who had organized his professional life around a set of assumptions and watched the ground beneath those assumptions dissolve. He had not believed American industry could match German quality. He had fought beside that belief for 2 years. He had accepted casualties that the belief helped make bearable, because at least they were dying with superior machines. At least the technological advantage was real, even if the strategic situation was not recoverable. Pershing had not just destroyed his tank. It had removed the last coherent source of confidence he had carried through a losing war. What neither Steiner nor Wolf knew, what German crews encountering Pershings across March and April of 1945 could not have known, was how few of these tanks were actually present. Approximately 20 Pershings saw sustained combat in the entire European war. Perhaps another 100 had reached the continent by May. The statistical contribution was minimal. Perhaps 40 or 50 German armored vehicles destroyed across all Pershing engagements. but the knowledge of their existence had spread through German forces faster than the tanks themselves moved. American crews who had encountered Pershings described them on radio frequencies that German intercept units monitored. Prisoners mentioned American heavy tanks in interrogations. Frontline observers reported unfamiliar silhouettes with disproportionate gun barrels. The information moved through the fragmentary intelligence system still functioning in Germany's final weeks and attached itself to every unexplained loss. German crews began attributing tank kills they could not account for to the mysterious Deccan heavy tanks. Penetrations that exceeded what Shermans could achieve. Losses at ranges that should have been safe. Phenomenon exactly mirrored the Tiger fever that had afflicted American crews earlier in the war, the tendency under stress to assign inexplicable events to the most feared weapon available. Pershing's psychological reach exceeded its tactical one by an enormous margin. 20-some tanks engaging in combat across a front of hundreds of miles across weeks of fighting, and yet the fear spread further, faster, and more thoroughly than the tanks themselves could travel. German crews who never encountered a Pershing, who were destroyed by Shermans or tank destroyers or artillery or aircraft, were dying in the final weeks of the war with the knowledge that something was out there that they had no doctrine for and no reliable intelligence about. The uncertainty itself was a weapon. What would a captured Pershing have revealed to German engineers who had the time and resources to examine it? The armor would have presented a mixed assessment. Not impenetrable, not superior to the King Tiger, but substantially better than the Sherman. Designed with a philosophy of balanced adequacy across protection, firepower, and mobility rather than the German pursuit of maximum performance in individual parameters. The gun would have been sobering. 90 millimeters could defeat any German tank's frontal armor at typical combat ranges. The implications for German crews who had positioned their Panthers and Tigers in the confidence that frontal armor was reliable protection would not have been tactical. They would have been psychological. The mathematical certainty that had sustained German armored resistance through 2 years of strategic retreat was not certain. The engine and drivetrain would have impressed German testers accustomed to the maintenance demands of complex German power plants. The Ford engine was not powerful by German heavy tank standards. It was reliable. It started in cold weather. It used components available in the American supply system. The transmission was simpler and easier to operate than German manual systems. The manufacturing quality would have been the most devastating revelation. German engineers examining Pershing welds, its castings, its component finishing would have seen standards equivalent to German production achieved in a vehicle being built at rates Germany could never match. Germany had dismissed American manufacturing as capable of quantity but not quality. The Pershing would have proven both were achievable simultaneously. Beyond the vehicle itself, the existence of the Pershing pointed toward a pipeline German intelligence would have found it difficult to report honestly to frontline units. The T-26 E4 Super Pershing, with its enhanced gun, existed in limited production. The T-26E with increased frontal armor existed in prototype form. The T-29 mounting a 105mm gun was under development. The T-30 with a 155mm gun existed in design. American engineering was accelerating past German capabilities while the Reich collapsed. The final engagement between a Pershing and German armor occurred on April 24th, 1945, near Dessau. A Panzer IV attempting to cross a bridge encountered a Pershing from the 3rd Armored Division at approximately 600 meters. The Pershing fired. The Panzer IV's 80 millimeters of frontal armor had no chance against 90 millimeters of American gun at that range. The penetration was complete. The crew evacuated. The tank was left burning. 3 days later, Germany surrendered. Werner Wolf had asked what else they had been wrong about. The question was broader than any individual weapon system or any single tactical engagement. If If American democracy could produce a machine equal to German engineering while maintaining production advantages Germany could never match, what did that mean about every assumption the Reich had built itself upon? The Pershing was not the answer to the war. The war was effectively decided before most Pershings reached Europe. It was the evidence. Evidence that the technical superiority German crews had used to sustain their fighting will through retreat after retreat was not a permanent condition. It was a temporary advantage, and it had already ended. The M26 Pershing became the foundation of American armored power for 30 years after the war ended. The M46, the M47, the M48, the M60, which fought in Korea and Vietnam and equipped NATO allies through the entirety of the Cold War, all traced their engineering lineage directly to the tank McNair had resisted, and Barnes had fought to build, and Smoyer had used to destroy a Panther in 15 seconds in the ruins of Cologne. The mathematics had changed. They had changed too late to alter an outcome that was already decided, but they had changed. And the men in the burning Panthers and Tigers, in Germany's final weeks, died with the knowledge, fragmentary and uncertain and deeply unsettling, that something had happened that they had been told was not possible. That was the Pershing's real legacy in the war it was too late to change. Not the 40 or 50 German vehicles destroyed. Not the statistics. Question that burned in the minds of men who had been told their machines were invincible and discovered they were not. What else were we wrong about?